Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's discussion on fake news no more, ? My name is Benjamin Becker. I'm the managing director of America's North Rhine-Westphalia, a transatlantic NGO, and together with the CBYX programs coordinating force of the GIZ, a German organization, we welcome you to tonight's discussion. Let me in particular welcome our panelists for tonight, Angie Holan from the US, Professor Kurt Knüpfer from Berlin. We have Alex Oil, our dearest moderator from Cologne. We have Theo Fuß from the GIZ from either Bonn or Cologne, wherever you're sitting right now. And let me in particular shout out to the this year's participants of the Congress Bundestag's Youth Exchange, and of course to America House North Rhine-Westphalia. Your fake news, I think we all remember that sentence and the emotional uproar which it caused on both sides of the spectrum. Now, during President Trump's tenure, fake news seemed to be omnipresent. To a degree, it was increasingly discussed whether this term should be abandoned altogether, maybe replaced by disinformation or other terms, as it did no longer describe a status, but rather a weapon of information. But fake news are no invention of the past 4 years, by no means. On the contrary, both disinformation and its use as a weapon have been out there for quite a while, and so has fact-checking as one effective measure to counter disinformation. Tonight, we will discuss these phenomena from a dual angle, from a journalistic one and an academic one. And I'm very glad and very honored to welcome two or three experts on the topic to tonight's panel. Let me start by introducing to you Angie Holan. She's an editor of PolitiFact. That's a US-based but internationally recognized fact-checking website. In 2009, Angie Holan was a reporter on the PolitiFact team that won the, it's incredible, but let me stress it, the 2009 Pulitzer Prize for national reporting. Incredible still. Angie serves on the advisory board of the International Fact-Checking Network, so she's internationally recognized and connected. And in spring 2018, when Corona was still a beer, we were lucky to have hosted Angie for an acclaimed live talk in Cologne. Tonight, we toast to you across the Atlantic and welcome Angie Holan. Dr. Kurt Knüpfer is an assistant professor of political science at Freie University, Berlin's JFK Institute. You all know it, very renowned American Studies Institute. He has a particular focus on political communication and the US media system, and his teaching and research focus on the digital or non-digital transformation of the public sphere and contemporary media systems, with a particular focus on right-wing media and transnational information flows. While Angie Holan, and now comes the very interesting part, quite naturally thinks very highly of fact-checking as an effective measure to counter disinformation, Professor Knüpfer is more pessimistic in this regard, maybe from an academic stance, but I'm very interested in learning more about this and having him explain why that is. So welcome from Berlin, Kurt Knüpfer. And now every discussion, of course, needs a very skilled moderator, and Alex Oil is more than that. She's a trained journalist herself. She's worked as a staff writer for Emma. That's the leading German feminist magazine. She has worked as an editor for the leading German public radio station Deutschlandfunk, and has recently joined the podcasting realm with her podcast Fast 40, in English, Almost 40. Check it out, it's really, really good. Alex is no Pulitzer laureate yet, but she did win the prestigious Arthur F. Burns Fellowship, and as part of this worked as a guest editor for the Globe and Mail in Toronto. Alex has moderated several acclaimed discussions with us. Among them, she moderated the Canadian ambassador to Germany, His Excellency Stéphane Dion. And tonight, we are most honored and pleased to have her here as our dearest moderator. Welcome, Alex. Now, allow me to end with these brief remarks. First of all, you all know the drill. We are all Zoom trained by now. There is a program, there is a website. You will find us, I'm pretty sure. Please do come back and please sign up for our newsletter. We won't spam you, it's just relevant information. Second, if you want to participate, and we stress interactivity, please do so. Please write us your questions, your comments, your criticism, your praise in the Q&A section, the F&A section below. We will We will move that over digitally to Alex, and she can include it in her moderation. And who will move that over physically? It's my dearest colleague, Katarina. She will handle things in the back as we are talking. So thanks to Katie, thanks to the team. And now it's my pleasure to, before we start, at the beginning of my remarks, I mentioned the Congress Bundestag Youth Exchange Program guests. Now, due to the pandemic, the program can't take place in physical reality at the moment, but it wasn't canceled. It takes part in a virtual sphere, thanks to Theo Fuß and his team from the German Society for International Cooperation, GIZ in German, GITS. It's not the money collecting guys, it's the international guys. And I'm more than happy to have Theo, to have won him for a word of welcome. So thanks, Theo, for the great cooperation. Over to Theo Fuß, and I'll mute myself, and Theo, you can hand over to Alex then. Everyone, enjoy tonight. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Benjamin. Both of for the general cooperation between the program and you guys at the America House, and of course of having me tonight here with you in this opening part for today's event. I would also like to welcome, of course, all panelists and you all in the audience, and send, of course, a particular hello to our Congress Bundestag Youth Exchange program students. As you can imagine, and Benjamin mentioned this already, there has not been very much of an exchange program this year, at least not a physical one due to the corona pandemic. What we do have, though, is a virtual CBYX program that we, the GIZ, together with our US partner organization, Cultural Vistas, helped to create as a sort of a compensation for the canceled physical exchange. And this virtual program consists mainly of a series of seminar, workshop, and lecture events to provide our students with some basic insights into US-German historical, cultural, and political relations. And the event tonight is part of this program series. When discussing this project with Benjamin Becker and a possible cooperation, we fairly quickly came up with the idea of having a common event, and this about the role of media in the US and Germany. And I'm very glad that we could win Professor Kurt Knüpfer and Angie Holan to become part of this event. Well, I have been looking for this evening for quite some time, actually, and I'm sure you will understand why once this event is over. So listen carefully, have fun, and thanks for your attention. And I hand over now to Alex.
I should activate my microphone first. Thank you very much for passing over. A warm welcome from me as well to Angie Holan and Kurt Knüpfer, our amazing panelists tonight. And also hello to our virtual audience, which unfortunately we can't see, but I'm sure your questions will be great and interesting in the end. And for myself, as Benjamin said before, please feel free to ask as much as you can tonight to add to this discussion. So I will start with the questioning now, and just one more information. So we decided to stay with the German duo, which is Kurt and Angie. So Angie, I start with you first. Are you less busy at PolitiFact since Donald Trump has left the White House?
You know, our pace has become more regular and predictable, I would say. I wouldn't say we're less busy. Our staff is the same size. We're still doing as many reports, but we can call it a day at the end of the day, and we're not surprised by tweeting in the middle of the night or anything like that.
So this is an interesting point. So you work as a fact checker since 2007, right? Which was a time when people haven't been speaking a lot about fact checking at all. But if you look at all these years and the time when you had to report about Donald Trump a lot, and how far did the whole system of fact-checking and how far did the distribution of fake news change in the last years?
It's been a very interesting journey. I started with PolitiFact in 2007 as a reporter. I became editor in 2013. And it's funny because I was looking through my old photos and notes to remember when I had come to Cologne, and it was 2018, March 2018, so almost 3 years ago. And it's been a very rapidly changing and evolving media landscape. We started really to fact check elections, and we thought that we would mostly be spending all of our time on the campaigns and on the candidates, and that was certainly true at that time. We did a little bit of fact checking around misinformation. Back then, the dominant format was what we would call chain emails. They're so much less common today. So now I feel like I have to explain to the younger audiences that once upon a time, we didn't have Facebook and Twitter. So you would just email messages to everybody that you knew. And a lot of people who were sharing misinformation did it that way. So back then, we primarily fact-checked the mainstream political conversation. But over the years, we saw Facebook move from colleges to all over the country and all over the world. We saw Twitter spread, and misinformation is now a significant part of our work. And while we still do our traditional fact-checking of politicians, we also do a significant amount of fact-checking of misinformation on Facebook through a formal partnership with Facebook. And we also have a partnership with TikTok. And then we just seek out misinformation on the internet wherever we find it. And just so, I hope people are familiar with our website, but if you're not, our reports tend to follow the same format where we're fact-checking one statement. We write all of our research and all of our findings, and then at the end, we rate it. And the ratings go from true to mostly true to half true to mostly false to pants on fire. That's pants on fire is our worst rating. It's it's American slang from liar, liar, pants on fire, and that is our worst rating.
So how much more pants on fire do you have today in comparison to 10 years ago?
What we saw, sometimes I hardly know where to start with the Trump presidency. I don't think I need to go on at length, but he was a politician who would say whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted to, whether it was true or false. And one of my colleagues in the US, the Washington Post fact checker, made a job of documenting all the falsehoods, and it was in the tens of thousands of how many falsehoods Trump uttered in the course of his whole presidency. We found that many of the things that we chose to fact check from Trump were rated false or pants on fire. In fact, the last time we calculated it, we looked at all the statements we chose to evaluate, and 70% were pants on fire, false, or mostly false. So, what did this mean for U.S. society? Well, we started seeing this pattern, a typical pattern where misinformation would start on the internet, either social media or generally far-right websites. Then it would be picked up by television and radio, Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, and then President Trump would repeat it. And as the information moved through this system, it was amplified and more amplified. So we did continue our fact checking of the left and of the Democrats, but we did spend most of our time fact checking the president, Donald Trump, and this misinformation cycle that we observed. And I would just want to add that PolitiFact is nonpartisan. We do fact check all the parties. We fact check whatever is said in the public discourse, but we don't select statements to fact check randomly. We look for statements that are provocative and attention grabbing and that people are talking about.
Mr. Knüpfer, you are monitoring the US media system for 10 years now. Or court, we say, from your point of view, where is the increase in circulation of disinformation is coming from, and how would you describe the whole system? And if I'm not quite sure, I think you even prepared some slides you wanted to present about your research on misinformation in the US.
Yeah, so yes, so I'm a political scientist that way. I go nowhere without a very elaborate PowerPoint presentation, especially not these days. So if I could, maybe I'll just throw some things up on the screen, and then you can interrupt me at any time and tell me to stop, right? If it gets if it's too much. But so I wanted to really take a look at kind of the systemic factors here of what really causes misinformation, why we're talking about fake news. And the first thing I wanted to highlight is the particular role that we see in the United States for institutions that are engaged in this. So the sort of stuff we're also talking about here with fact-checking and journalism. And if you can see this now, I hope the slide is up. It should, okay, great. So colleagues at the University of Zurich, they did a transnational kind of study, cross-national comparison to look at which systems, which countries were particularly resilient against disinformation. And they came to the conclusion in 2020, this was published, that the US really forms an outlier, meaning it's all the way on the spectrum to the right here, all the way up here. I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor, but let me just tell you that this indicator is not good, okay? So this basically, if we want to flip this around, we can say that the United States in a cross-national comparison is highly receptive for disinformation. And they base these findings on whether or not institutions were in place that were able to counter factually incorrect information and basically stop the circulation thereof. And they looked at things like how well is the media system doing, how privatized is it, how high is the populism index, etc. So not good news for the United States. And I was told I don't have a lot of time, so I transformed all of my, all of my academic knowledge into basically one hot take, or I hope to. And that is essentially that we shouldn't speak about fake news so much as we should be talking about an epistemic crisis. And this is a consequence of institutional decline. Okay, big words, I'm sorry. But basically what I mean is it's not just a circulation of factually incorrect information that we're dealing with, but a fundamental disagreement again and again over what constitutes reality, what is even real, what is true between, and this is important, political partisans especially. So that's not to say that there isn't misinformation out there or that there isn't, disinformation floating around that's perhaps apolitical. But it is to say that when it matters, right, it tends to be spread by political partisans. And the root causes for this lie in drivers of intense partisanship, right, fairly obvious, and also a decline in trust and social cohesion within kind of society and the political system. Okay, here's where the slides get bad. Okay, so I apologize in advance. Really quickly, I'm just gonna zoom through this, okay? How did we get here? Okay, so big story, and I think most people know the story and they're gonna answer it with digitalization, right? Technology happened, so there's technological change. There's Facebook now, right? There's all of these social media sites, etc. And I think they're right in saying that. So I'm going to agree with everyone and say yes, but also there are these other structural forces at play. So it's not just technology. And by saying this, I'm not saying that it's not technology, is what I want to point at here. So there's audience segmentation. That's one important thing. So I want people to take away three things here. Audience segmentation, which means that basically you are now afforded the possibility of targeting your ads, right, to a particular audience. And this incentivizes more sensationalizing, partisan, niche news, basically. So here are my footnotes for all of that. I can send you those if anyone's interested in reading up on the literature. The second thing is market consolidation. Basically, this means that you have a lot of big companies that are buying up media real estate all over the United States, whether it's in radio, in print, but also increasingly in local television. This means that local news is essentially disappearing and it's being replaced by more national syndicated news products. And these tend to focus on politics, highly polarizing politics between the two big factions, parties in the United States. And the third thing, or here the fourth thing I should say, is that we are dealing with, and this is where it might get a little bit controversial, a long-term coordinated ideological project on the far right. And we are seeing the emergence of really asymmetries increasingly within the partisan news ecology. We are seeing the emergence of a vast right-wing counterpublic. And here I also brought data to back that up if anyone's interested in the footnotes. I have a couple of more slides. You can just nod at me if I should continue, or if I should stop, then you can also shake your head like this. Is maybe 2 or 3 more things if I can add them, if that's fine.
Of course, please go on. Okay,
yeah, sorry. So my conclusion to my hot take is that we really need to talk about political partisanship and asymmetries. And I really think that's what Angie just said regarding kind of where are you seeing kind of these forms of misinformation emerge, and that it tends to be again and again from the right side of the spectrum. I think this is something that we need to address, right? And this is what I'm all about in my research. So partisanship, I'm not going to bore you with the details, but there are a lot of studies on this that say that who is likely to spread fake news is also highly likely to be a political partisan, right? So from the left or the right, if you're kind of ideologically kind of minded, then you're more likely to pick out sources and stories that seem too good not to be true and pass them along, right? But here people also in experiments point out again and again that this tendency seems to be especially prevalent among Republicans. Also, decline in news, right? Remember I said that there's a decline in trust and social cohesion. We see this basically all over the political spectrum, right? So since the 70s, trust in news has declined in the US dramatically. However, it's declined most dramatically for one particular subgroup, and that is Republicans. So at this point, it's only 10%, if you can believe that, right? 10% say that they still trust the media. This has implications because if you don't trust the media, you're also more likely to share fake news, right? Other studies have shown this. And we want to point out that it's not the case that Republicans don't trust any news source, right? They just don't trust most of the things that we consider kind of to be the mainstream. Instead, they turn increasingly to this, what I mentioned earlier, this right-wing counterpublic, right? So they do trust outlets like Fox News, for example, or also talk radio, like Limbaugh, who was mentioned, or Hannity, who also has a show on Fox. Increasingly also alternative websites like Breitbart, etc. This has effects. So if we look at some of the kind of misperceptions, for example, around COVID, right, coronavirus, we see that one group in particular, Fox News Republicans, right, people that are Republican and trust Fox News a lot, are more likely to believe that coronavirus came from a lab, that it was inevitable, this outbreak, and that it's not a critical issue, it'll just disappear, right, like a miracle. If we look at also election coverage, which was mentioned, right, one of the most vocal places that you heard kind of these claims, claims of election fraud, which are not substantiated, it's basically fake news, was Fox News, was Newsmax, OAN, right-wing websites, etc. So does this happen on the left and the right? It doesn't. We are seeing nothing of the same scale on kind of the left side of the political spectrum and left-wing alternative media, because here, as people have pointed out, they tend to police each other. So if you're factually inaccurate in the mainstream media, there are consequences usually, right? You get fact-checked by the Washington Post if you're working at the New York Times, right? You get flagged from other journalists. You might even lose your job, right? If you do this on the right, you say the election was stolen, etc., right? There are no consequences. You can double down on this, and instead you get policed by other right-wing media outlets for ideological purity, but not factual accuracy, is what one study found here that I wanted to point to. Last slide. This, is something that I got from my research back when I studied climate change and how right-wing media was reporting on it. And I just, there's so much talk of kind of Russian bots influencing the media sphere and Donald Trump, etc. But we shouldn't forget that this is an ongoing project on the right to undermine trust in existing institutions, to undermine social cohesion, and to tell their listeners, so this is Rush Limbaugh, this is taken from his website, that he is in the universe of reality, right? Rush Limbaugh recently died, by the way, but highly influential figure in American politics. And on the other side, right, is the universe of lies. And here we see the fact checkers, the journalists, academia, right? Guys like me, science, I don't know why they're kind of dividing that out. And this is what listeners are being told again and again, right? So this makes it really kind of, this is fertile ground, is the end of my hot take for all of these things. And so I just want to push everyone to say, like, we need to acknowledge this, even though it makes us seem partisan, etc., right? And we want to shy away from kind of pointing to one side. I think we need to acknowledge kind of these domestic sources, these institutional factors, and these long trajectories of what is going on in order to discuss this topic. End of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Kurt. Very interesting. And I would just take some of the information and pass them right on to Angie. Angie, if you look at these people talking about the universe of lies, do you think they are audience of PolitiFact? Do you think you reach people that believe in conspiracy theories, that think journalists lie, and so on? Is this your audience?
I would say, based on my email, yes, it is, at least partially. And I do want to say, I thought Kurt's presentation was terrific, and that really does track with the things that we've observed anecdotally, and I really appreciated the research citations as well. Those are some of the researchers that I look at as well. We're in such a strange moment. So PolitiFact's audience, I know, tends to be slightly democratic, but we also have these independents in our audience who will say, like, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican, I'm just looking for the truth. And then we seem to have a core of people who are Trump fans, Rush Limbaugh fans, very hostile to fact checking, but they read our work and they respond to it in their own way, which is usually to tell us how wrong we are. So I do say that just to say that the idea that we're all in these filter bubbles and we don't see the other side, I think is wrong. I think that these different audiences are interacting to some extent, and I certainly see them all in our audience. Now, having said that, I do think that one of the important things that Kurt mentioned was the lessening of the prominence of institutions, because we really do see with the audience, like, they're getting their own news through all sorts of different channels. Sometimes they have a favorite media source, but sometimes they'll go away from that source. There's not an agreement on a set of facts by any means. And then there's so much information out there that people certainly only have a certain span of attention for it all. So when I think about audience and PolitiFact and our fact checks getting in front of people, I don't think they're getting in front of all the people. I think some people are distracted and overwhelmed with news and just go to a few sources. I think some people don't want to see fact-checking content or engage with it. And how all these things interact seems to be evolving and changing as we go forward. Oh, Alexandra, you're muted.
So, Kurt, if you look at the classic media system, when do you think this asymmetric which you described, when did it develop? When did people turn away from the classic media system?
Well, here, I kind of brushed off kind of technology and said yes and, right? But if we think about really media systems on kind of this large scale, right? And we really think of centuries, right? Here in Berlin, probably most people kind of know the Berlin skyline. There's this tower, right? So if you think of Berlin kind of as this, with its kind of famous landmark, right? That really is a mark of kind of the broadcast era, right? So you have a city, right, that is no longer structured around kind of the church or the market, but really around kind of this center figure of reaching a lot of people from one single source, right? And that had downsides, right? So that meant this was a media system that was highly exclusionary, right? The people that were in power were able to broadcast what they wanted to put out there. You had a single source and many recipients. And so with the internet and technology, this has become more democratic, right? But it's also become more diffused. And we're seeing kind of now, if you will, kind of the pushback, the dark side of what was once hailed as kind of this opening up and this emancipatory power of technology. And again, we have to stress here, how does this come about? It comes about as soon as ideology is introduced, as soon as politics are introduced, and we see an amassing of certain kind of values that are able to be loud enough to drown other voices out, to call people the lying press, etc., right, without making any claims to back that up, etc. And they are also given a megaphone now through this environment. And it's a tough situation, because on the one hand, we want to say, yay, for pluralism and democracy. But on the other hand, we are seeing that this brings to the fore very vocal, very organized minorities that are able to use these tools, right, to be louder than they'd usually be, to intimidate other people, to drown out other voices, etc. And this is, I think, where we are at as a society, not just in the United States, but also certainly all over Europe and more or less all over the world right now.
Mm-hmm. So social media is in some way also an engine for disinformation, right? So Angie, you cooperate with Facebook, for example. How difficult is it to find a common way, like a way to, on the one hand, help to dismantle disinformation on these platforms, and at the same time find a common strategy with the industry behind it?
Well, the Facebook program has been fascinating, and we've learned so much from it. It started shortly after the 2016 election. I'm part of the International Fact-Checking Network, and several of us fact-checking organizations got together and wrote an open letter to Facebook and said, we think you have a problem with misinformation on your platform, and we believe we can help. They responded, and launched a program that they call the third-party fact-checking program. And it's in multiple countries around the world now. There are actually 3 groups that fact-check in Germany. And the way this program works is that once Facebook decides to work with a fact-checking organization, they give the fact-checkers access to a queue that looks like a news feed of like the worst post you've ever seen. Everything that readers have checked is potentially false, some things that their algorithm unearths. We get to look at this queue and pick out things to fact check. PolitiFact tends to focus on political topics, although we certainly do a great deal around the coronavirus and COVID-19. We fact check the statements, we issue our ratings, we post on our website, and then we feed our ratings back to Facebook. And when posts are found to be false, Facebook de-emphasizes the content, and in some cases they remove it entirely. But it's not a perfect system because, first off, Facebook has a number of policies that sometimes contradict each other, such as they give an exemption to politicians and candidates. Facebook has said they do not want to inhibit political speech. So candidates and elected officials can say things that fact checkers find false, and Facebook does not reduce the spread of those messages. But what the program overall has taught us is that we can fact check content on the internet, and Facebook matches the fact check findings, so we can also do it at scale. And these are very bright points for me, because what I think it shows is that rather than just throwing our hands up and saying there's nothing that can be done about misinformation on the internet, we find that there are strategies that actually work, that are tested, that are practical, that can be deployed at scale. So I think in the US right now, there's more talk than there's ever been about regulation or new legislation around the internet companies. And I've said before, this is very much needed. if we're going to have consistent standards on the internet to downgrade misinformation. Certainly journalists in the US, we've always been for freedom of expression. So this isn't about censoring anybody, but it is about downgrading information that is literally wrong. So we have had this program with Facebook, and we're working with TikTok as well, but YouTube has not started any sort of program of this type. So that's another failing.
One following question, which you both might have an opinion on, is that studies also have shown that even if people are confronted with the correction of a disinformation, they still tend to keep up their old opinion because they just don't like their worldview to be challenged. So what are good strategies to overcome this human behavior?
Well, I would say I would love, and I can't wait to hear what Kurt has to say. What I see, and we've done some evidence-based studies on this, is that fact-checking is an incremental improvement. It's not like and misinformation is not a problem to be solved that then it goes away, but it's more like an ongoing issue that needs basically it needs to be managed on an ongoing basis. Because we do see that even people with opposing political views often correct themselves. Not everybody, but many of them. So I guess in answer to your question, I'd say we shouldn't hope for the perfect, we should be hoping for improvements, and with other sorts of interventions as well, like media literacy would be a big one. And I do think there is also a battle going on in the Republican Party between Republicans and conservatives on this issue of factuality. So I just think there are a lot of different vectors that can come and improve the problem, but we'll probably always have a little bit misinformation that we have to deal with.
Kurt?
Yeah, I completely agree that it's also highly complex, right? This is because this involves kind of media systems, but it also involves the level of just human cognition. And so there are a couple of studies that we can cite that point towards that people tend not to, or that if misinformation is corrected, right, that they double down. Motivated reasoning, etc., is what these processes are called. But there are also studies that show that this isn't the case. And it kind of depends on the person, but also the type of information. Oh, someone new on the line.
Hello? Who is this?
So yes, so, I think that was Benjamin Becker's right, account. So what I was saying is that it is highly complex, and we're just beginning. So the media affects people. I should say I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a person who studies really kind of the cognition of media. They are all just at the beginning of this, right? Change has been so rapid, and we really kind of need to take a holistic approach in order to understand human psychology, political partisanship, ideology. All of these things converge, right? And then technology is added on top, right? And technology keeps changing. The terms of service keep changing. So it's really a difficult task right now to figure all of this out. And this is also why I think Benjamin Becker said before that, I take more of a critical view of fact-checking, which is not, so I want to clarify that. I think this is a hugely important work, and it's quite the opposite. I think there isn't enough of it going on. This is my problem. I think that we need to strengthen kind of these institutions that, go out there, put themselves out there, don't do it for kind of clicks and attention, but really in pursuit of the truth. And in order to have that, you need professional people. You need to pay people that are taking on these tasks. And to some extent, it's great that Facebook is doing these partnerships. To some extent, I think we need to take these companies to task, right? They are multi-billion globally operating enterprises that make profit all over the world. They need to be forced in some part to pay for all of this, right? And to invest in civic institutions and into research that can help us better understand some of these problems, these emerging problems that we're seeing on the various levels.
Angie, do you think they will pay?
I think that they I think that if we're looking across the industry, that they are waiting for requirements from the government about what they have to do. So I think because I think they're all kind of like looking at each other, and they know it's a problem. They're not eager to change their business models. They don't seem to want to put themselves at competitive disadvantages against each other. So I think, I do think that it's an area where I think government is the proper way to intervene. Now, I think these companies are also under quite a bit of pressure from their users, from some of their advertisers, and frankly, from their own employees. So when I look at the platforms overall, I see that they if we make them do better, I think they will. But so far, especially in the US, we still have not taken those steps legislatively or even a regulatory framework, although the Biden administration is quite new, so we'll see what happens. I did want to, can I circle back to something that Kurt said, though? I do think that in the US, with the dealing with Donald Trump and all of his misinformation, I saw the US media improve its performance as time went on. And I think one of the strengths of the US media towards the end of the Trump administration was that there were fact-checking elements in all the major news reports, and especially the largest newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and then the network news programs of ABC News, NBC, CBS. So that that was a very positive sign in the final years of the Trump administration, is that he was saying these things that were false, but the news coverage was just deluged with corrective information. So that was positive.
You mentioned the pressure on the platforms, but also the pressure on fact checkers is pretty high, right? I've read an interview you gave, and you were talking about all the harassment and the violence you receive by people who are just not who just are upset with what you're doing.
Yeah, we haven't received at PolitiFact any actual violence, which I'm very grateful for, but we do receive ongoing threats, sometimes explicit, sometimes implied. And I think that we're not the only institution that is working against misinformation that's facing that. I think, I mean, politicians who are arguing against misinformation talk about this. Clergy in the US gets threats when they issue statements against misinformation. It's strange to me, and I don't fully understand why the misinformation tends to be accompanied by threats and harassment. I mean, I understand it on one level. They don't have facts to back them up, so what do they have to resort to? But it's definitely worse than I've seen in my professional life. I mean, it's really a moment.
And in January, the people even took the hate to the streets, right? There was a storm on the Capitol, and which was like taking the whole movement from online to offline in a way.
Very much so. I mean, I think that will be, between that and COVID-19, I think we have all the evidence that we now need to show that misinformation has real world consequences. I mean, I think in the US, at least before, there was some sort of like, well, you know, people want to do conspiracy theories on the internet, that's their hobby, whatever. I don't think most people feel that way now. I think many people, even some Trump supporters, were horrified by what they saw on January 6th. And really, we've seen the Republican Party and the conservative movement having this conversation with itself. Now, it's not clear that factuality is winning, by no means. In fact, I think that you can look at the US political landscape, and I think you clearly saw Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell push back against Donald Trump and the conspiracy-minded people in his party, and he was pushed back against. And now, like, it's not clear at all where the party is going to end up. But I also can't emphasize enough how Trump is so different from what went before him. I mean, President George W. Bush did not traffic in conspiracy theories, not in the least. And he also didn't do the sort of verbal bullying that Trump did. So I think we need to be watching and seeing what happens next with the party, because I think some people think that Trump was an aberration and some people don't. And the internal conversation within the party is one of the most fascinating stories in US politics right now. Joe Biden, on the other hand, is really playing the role of, he's a centrist Democrat. He's trying to keep his party together. He's kind of like everybody be calm. let's turn the volume down on politics. I mean, he very much said during the campaign that's what he wanted to do, and now he's in the presidency, and that is exactly what he's doing.
Kurt, we are also facing a big election in autumn, right? If you compare the situation in Germany to the situation in the US, what is your conclusion?
It's really an important and interesting question, and how far, you know, I teach at an institute here at the John F. Kennedy Institute in Berlin, where it's highly interdisciplinary, right? And it turns around this concept of American studies. And in American studies, there's always this idea of American exceptionalism, right? And political scientists don't like that so much, because we tend to be comparativists, and we tend to say, of course you can compare things, right? And no set of institutions is exceptional. But there's really a raging debate about kind of what's really specific to the United States, and what are elements that we're seeing elsewhere. And we see that kind of technology is kind of ubiquitous, right? It's all over the world, and some places more developed than others, but then they're getting there. And we see other institutions as well, right? So in Central Europe, we have sort of for a long time, if you remember that graph I showed right at the beginning, and you look at the other side of that spectrum, right? Not the United States on the far right as being not resilient against disinformation. On the far left, you have all of these Scandinavian countries, right, with heavy investments into kind of the civil society and kind of public media infrastructures, etc., and so on. That being said, even in these places, right, and also in Germany, we are seeing a lot of the same tendencies when it comes to kind of the rise of alternative publics. And here too, I would argue, and this is perhaps something we could throw back into the room, maybe this is, you know, to a researcher on right-wing media, everything looks like a nail. We are also seeing that these are infused with ideology, and they are primarily a challenge from the populist right wing, right? So we're not really seeing the emergence of the same kind of thing on the far left to the same degree. Instead, whenever these movements and parties mobilize, it tends to be on the far right, whether we are looking at Sweden, certainly Denmark, Germany, Finland to some extent, but also the other countries like Spain now with Vox Party, etc., and even in Portugal, we're seeing the emergence of this. So,
in your talk, you mentioned the role of right-wing media in the US for this increase of the spread of disinformation. Would you say we have the same situation in Germany or in Europe, that right-wing media are on the rise, and that they are kind of like having a greater outreach than they had before?
I think we're seeing kind of a double movement of kind of the rise of a certain political ideology, but also the affordances of the technological system, of the media system, to build new outlets on which to propagate ideas. But it's not a one-way street. These new communication possibilities also mean that parties and political elites are more attuned with what is being said, right, in their networks. So they can talk back, right? And what we're seeing with a lot of these emerging parties is that they're heavily engaged in online activities. So the AfD is by far, for example, the most active on Facebook, and also on YouTube, right? And they are really engaged with their communities and their supporter networks. Same as Trump, if you think back, right? And many of kind of the Trumpian Republicans, they are kind of living memes to some extent, right? Sometimes they say stuff that you're not even going to understand because they're talking to internet lingo, right? And they're kind of interacting with a base that they know from kind of these alternative channels. So they're putting their ear kind of to these networks, right? And they're cooking up these topics, right? That sometimes have no basis in factual realities, such as the QAnon kind of conspiracies, but sometimes they do, right? And then they take kind of frames that are circulating anyway, what to kind of do about COVID, right? And all of these things. And they turn this into a narrative that really resonates with their base because to a large degree, it's derived from their base, right? So that's kind of what we're seeing.
So before I turn to the questions of the audience, there are some already, I would like to ask a rather practical questions to both of you. So if you want to reach a very diverse audience with fact-checking, what are the best strategies to bring information to the people?
It sounds like such a straightforward question, but it's quite challenging. When we started, we published primarily on our website and through our partners. We have some newspapers and television and radio stations that we publish through. And we've kind of been developing as an online national news outlet. So we have an email list. The Facebook program that I mentioned, one of its advantages is that it puts the Facebook content in front of people who aren't necessarily, it puts the fact-checking content in front of users who aren't necessarily looking for it. We talked about harassment earlier. I think some of the upsurge in the harassment we see is because of that. So people aren't like, oh, I want to read the nice fact-checking article. Instead, one of their stories is getting an obscuring filter put over it, and they get a message that the fact-checkers found that they were wrong. But that's been a way to get in front of people. We've also been doing YouTube videos with PolitiFact to try to reach a different audience. I think the question of reaching audience is one of the most critical ones that news organizations are dealing with because of the segmentation of the media, the segmentation of the audience, and also, again, just the attention economy is so challenging. But one of the heartening things is that we're seeing fact-checking and ideas around fact-checking kind of spreading through other institutions. So we're seeing more media literacy in the schools. In the US, we have a group aimed at retired people called AARP. They recently started a media literacy program for seniors with a group that we work with called MediaWise. So I think that there's not a simple answer to your question about how we get in front of the right audiences, but we're certainly trying all the different pathways that we can.
Kurt, you want to add something?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not involved in kind of these, so maybe I can, you know, just from kind of like the academic perspective here, I think on the micro level, right, on the individual, like who's responsive to this, I think we just need to acknowledge that sometimes what gets the most clicks and the most attention and has the largest impact is not necessarily what's best on the informational level, right? So I think it's important to acknowledge that maybe there is value in putting the truth out there, right? Even if you're drowned out by all of these other voices for now, but you're doing kind of archival work to a degree, right? You're speaking perhaps to the people that later on are going to look at this and come to the facts and really need this. So that's why I think it's also important to kind of remove these practices from kind of the daily grind of politics and the fast-paced kind of sensationalist, you know, algorithmic driven kind of news production that we're seeing, and really pay people to have the time to kind of archive this and to look at the things, no matter whether they find an audience or not. And I think that's hugely important for one. Yeah, I don't have any, you know, smart, like this is going to fix this or it's going to bring it in front of the audience. I think I want to point more towards the dangers of this as well when you try to force this too much, right? Because there are narratives in place, you know, that I think aren't completely let's say, easy to discredit, or to just like dismiss in that sense. When people talk about kind of like the truth police, right, or a kind of censorship, etc., there are valid concerns sometimes behind this, right? And we want to be careful about kind of really policing the facts and making, forcing people to have the right set of facts and the right set of information. So that's certainly something, that where the conversation shouldn't be drifting. Yeah, so that's that's not really a satisfying answer. It's really a cop-out.
Yeah, but it is the question, like who checks the fact checkers, right? Angie, I think you have a very complicated system in place so that the fact checkers in the end don't do too many mistakes, right?
Right. Well, when people ask me who fact checks the fact checkers, I tell them everybody fact checks fact checkers. And I think that was one of the things Kurt alluded to earlier. It's like the media polices each other, but not only does the media police each other, the public polices us. And when we get things wrong, I mean, thankfully, we do have a lot of processes, like you mentioned, of listing sources, hyperlinking to sources. We have multiple edits of our reports. We have a lot of good processes in place to ensure accuracy, but at the end, we make the reports public, and they're written in a way so that anyone can replicate them. And we get a lot of scrutiny. We get some criticism. We very much feel that we're in the public eye, being kept to our standards. By everybody, but people seem to really respond to this model, because one of the things that's happened with PolitiFact in recent years is that we went from being part of a for-profit newspaper to moving to a nonprofit institute that is devoted to journalism. And once we became a nonprofit, we started a very robust membership program. So readers will contribute to us because they like fact checking, because they support fact checking. And that's become one of our major areas of revenue. Now, we're a small organization, but it really does go to the fact that this fact checking model deeply appeals to some parts of our audience and the electorate, so that by focusing in on the facts and the audience that appreciates the facts, we've been able to find a line of revenue to help support our work, and that's been extraordinarily helpful. In fact, it seems to be replacing some of the traditional revenue from advertising, and that's super helpful for us.
Okay, so now we turn to our audience. I will read their questions to you, Kurt and Angie. The first one is from Stuart Milne, and he's saying, thank you for taking our questions. One for Angie. How can, for instance, a Trump supporter who will dismiss anything CNN says about him be persuaded that fact-checking organizations like yours are reliable and trustworthy?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we have wrestled with that. And we've done some experiments where several years ago we did a tour to cities where the city had voted for Trump, and we did presentations on our methods to see if we could improve the outlook. And we saw improvements, but they weren't huge. They were kind of incremental improvements. So in some cases, I think that the best that we can hope for is, like, once we explain how we fact checked it and the method behind it, we can get a sort of grudging acceptance from some members of the audience, but not enthusiastic. Like, there are some people that you are not going to convince with fact checking. They need to be convinced by their peers or their social groups, but it just won't be that they're going to read a report online and have their minds changed.
Okay, next question is from Dina Schulte. How do you, this is for both of us, I guess, how do you explain the immense difference between Germany and the US regarding the mistrust in media coverage? Germany was on the left end of Mr. Knüpfer's first chart, the US on the right. Shouldn't you expect Germans to be more critical given our Nazi media history?
can I, so should I respond to that? Yeah, so so that question took a turn there towards the end. I had a whole response lined up, but that's super interesting, right? A super interesting question is media trust good, right? Do we want people to trust the media? And I think media trust is an indicator that measures several things, right? It doesn't necessarily only measure do you trust ARD, ZDF, the New York Times, Washington Post, etc. It also is a pretty good indicator. It correlates with other measurements for trust in society, right? So do you trust the institutions that are given a space on said media, for example, right? So if you think about media reports, right, a lot of it is really elected officials or experts, right, telling people something, right? So it's really a platform in that sense for other institutions to make their claim. So if you trust a system, if you believe that a system is just, if you believe a system is pluralistic and democratic, right, and you believe that this is the system you're living in, then media trust is good, right? We're seeing the same thing, I think, arguably also with the segments of the population that do not trust the media, where it's not just that they don't believe the Lügenpresse, but many of them really want systemic change, right? And this is certainly true in the US as well. If you look at this very, like manifest minority of Republican supporters that stormed the Capitol, for example, right? This isn't this was not an accident, right? Many of them came to Washington specifically for the purpose of overturning the election, right? Preventing President Biden to be sworn in, etc. They did not want the democratic process to play out. They want a different system. They want a different political project, and therefore they regard whoever stands for the current project as the enemy, right? The ideological enemy. So yeah, but yeah, highly interesting question. Thank you.
Angie, you want to add something?
Well, I would just, it's hard to answer this question without like making a lot of stereotypes about national character, which I'm always hesitant to do. But I will say, just based on the limited time that I've spent in Germany, it just seems that America has more divisions. We like to fight amongst ourselves a lot more. There's always arguments about who's a real American and who's not. I do think we're also still, the Trump years showed us we're still much dealing with our racial history and slavery and the end of the Civil War. Going all the way to the civil rights movement and now during the Trump era. So I think the US has some very specific history where the politics it just gets extremely vitriolic, and the misinformation seems to go hand in hand with extreme emotion. So most misinformation plays on anger or fear. And I just, when I look at the US culture, I see more of that than in right now in the German culture. But like I said, those are big stereotypes that I'm always a little bit cautious about, but maybe some of those ideas people might think over.
The next question is quite fitting. It's from Lee Flamond. I hope I pronounced it right. For both Angie and Kurt, if the epistemic crisis is A, structural, B, concerted and profitable, and C, possibly feeding primarily emotional needs, that's what you just said, how effective is fact-checking really going to be? Thanks in advance. Angie, you want to answer to that because it was just your point.
Yeah, I've actually put this question to some of the social like the neuroscientists that I've read and talked to. I think the idea of like the studies of human psychology are becoming really advanced, and they're drawing on neurology and all of that sort of thing. And I've asked, and like a lot of the science says that humans are emotional beings. They decide what they think first, and then they go look for evidence to support it. So I've said, like, well, then what am I doing here? Like, why am I fact checking? And they say, yes, human beings are emotional, but humans can also reason, and they reason better when they reason together. So we're not just by ourselves trying to figure out the world on our own. We're human beings and we talk together in groups. We socialize, we have these long conversations. And when a group of fact checkers are providing facts, it's like we're providing fuel for a healthier conversation. You know, one of the core functions of democracy are people coming together and deliberating and then arriving at common solutions, often through compromise, which is another word we don't talk enough about. And fact checking helps that. It's not the thing that that will make or break it, but it's an incremental improvement. So I think that's why I'm still very much interested and engaged in fact checking.
Mm-hmm. Kurt, do you want to add something?
Yes. Another really interesting question. I think that also, goes back to kind of, oh, here comes the academic who's going to say it's the system, right? And so any practice that is, is irrelevant, etc. And I also kind of want to push back against that again, because there are kind of, I think, also colleagues of mine who say, these problems run so deeply, right? They are ingrained in the system. They're going to pop up again and again, right? We really need to change fundamentally something in order to kind of approach them. And I think they're not wrong, okay? But if we can stick, I mean, if this isn't a bad taste these days, but if we stick to this resilience kind of metaphor, right? The idea that a system has resilience, and we can maybe see misinformation, disinformation as a sort of symptom, right? So if you have a cold, right, and somebody says you need to change your lifestyle, right, that might be true, you need to be healthier, but you still want something to also do to help you with that symptom, right? So it doesn't mean that just because it's only cough syrup, etc., to stick in this, it doesn't mean it's not helpful and super important, right? So yeah, I think that's what I kind of want to say to that. We don't always need to kind of, reform the entire system to also acknowledge that there are things being done, perhaps kind of on the meso level, sometimes even on the micro level, right? Where you kind of talk to a relative or, whatever, you as an individual. And these things also matter, right? We don't want to dismiss them just because they're not these big, large, everything's going to change and be different.
Okay. So next question for both speakers by Piper Powell. Do you see more misinformation being created / supported / spread on the far right or the far left? Or do they engage in fake news equally? Does this vary by country? Thank you. I think we had this point already, but maybe you can add on some more information about it.
We see more on the far right, but I would very much strongly recommend people not to see it as something that is that it's always going to be like that. I mean, I think that that's what we're seeing currently in U.S. history and even recent U.S. history. We've seen a conservative movement that has been much more tied to factuality and evidence-based reasoning, and so that may change. And also, the left is not immune. I mean, we do see left-leaning memes, some left-leaning misinformation. But I will say this, one of the weirdest things that happened during the Trump years is the Democrats started taking it as a political point that they were more factual. And the Democrats became even more like factual and evidence-y and proofy during the Trump years as a way to distinguish themselves politically from Trump. Which, like, as a fact checker, I'm just like, can't we make fact checking something that everybody likes? Do we have to turn it into a partisan issue? But we have seen some of that in the political messaging.
Mm-hmm. Kurt, you want to put a German perspective on it? Or a European perspective?
Yes, if I may, I absolutely do, because I think this is, I think we do, maybe there's slight, positional disagreement here, because I do think that we need to point out that it right now is something that we are seeing more on the far right, and I want to say that this also has kind of a longer trajectory in history, right? So I think as a phenomenon, right, theoretically, hypothetically, there's no reason to expect that political ideology is going to kind of be different. I think here the key indicator is highly partisan, right? Do you feel highly emotional about whatever your political preference is on that level? But I do think that as a political project, right, there simply does not exist the same infrastructure on the left that can for years, right, claim that global warming is either a hoax or it's too late to do anything about it, that can claim that Saddam Hussein is cooking up weapons of mass destruction and get away with it and still have the same people serving as news anchors on the same network, that can claim that, you know, COVID is a hoax, etc. Still same network that we're talking about, that can claim that the election is fraudulent and get away with it again and again, get offered positions within a political party, get offered talking spots in think tanks, etc. So this is what we're seeing in the US. And I think that it is country specific probably. There is no reason to think that in other places it would have to be kind of that same infrastructure. I just think that if we're just going to do the transatlantic kind of thing, there's certainly proponents of misinformation in Germany where that you would probably place more on the left spectrum, such as, you know, the esoteric kind of sphere when it comes to medicine, when it comes to the anti-vax movement, etc. However, as we've seen recently, when they align politically now, right, there tends to be kind of one party in Germany that says our doors are open, right? We are the alternative to the mainstream, and you with your extreme views are also on board. So we are going to hold a rally together with you. So when it comes to political organizing in Germany, it tends to be that the far right is trying to really kind of, you know, get their hooks into these movements as well. Okay,
so we have 3 minutes left, which will give us 2 really quick answers from you to this last questions, maybe a 1-sentence answer, although this is very difficult, and then I will try to sum up everything we said in 1 minute. Well, what do you recommend to people who are facing discussions with people that believe in fake news? Quick answer. Angie.
I mean, my recommendation is to approach them in as friendly a way as possible. So rather than saying something like, oh, you're so stupid, that's totally wrong, you might say, I read something that said something different. Maybe I could share it with you. Or I'm being like, that's a little bit joking, but it really is important to try to lower the temperature when you are dealing with someone who has misinformed views. And if they push back really hard, I personally would stop, because some people are not going to be persuaded.
Okay.
That's my advice.
Kurt, 1 sentence.
Yeah, I think that was a perfect answer. That you need to gauge the situation probably, and there you need to acknowledge that there are limits to what you can do. So in Germany, there tends to be this, it's your responsibility to, if you see somebody's, like to approach them and to get them out of their world. And that puts a lot of pressure on individuals, right? It puts a lot of strain on personal ties and family relations, your family WhatsApp group, etc., to always be the one to say, yeah, well, actually. So, if this is something that stresses you out psychologically, you also have to acknowledge the limits of your own agency, right? Of what you can do.
Okay, and now we need a point, because now we have 1 minute left until the whole system is going to stop. I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but I think this very practical advice for everybody who knows the situation in its own life is a very good point to stop this great conversation about fake news. Oh, I just get the news. It's not stopping. Oh, thank you, Katharina. This is the organizer in the back. So good. I'm very sorry. Do you want to add something to something you just said?
Yeah. So last thing about that is, right, think about your own personhood. Think about, focus on yourself also, right? So we tend to think of other people. They are always the people that, believe in false things. But even in these times with COVID going on, right, we might be targets, right? We might hold false beliefs. We might be partisan in some way. So it's also good to start with yourself on the individual level. Support your local fact checker, right? Make sure corporations pay taxes so that we can fund civil society. That's much more important on the kind of organizational level than kind of the individual, where you might not be able to do so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So this is something I think everybody, as I said, can take home and practice in its own life. And I think we had a very great discussion. Angie, Kurt, thank you so much. I think we learned a lot about fact-checking and what it can do, and also where are the difficulties with the whole system. And I also thank you so much to all the listeners and to the very interesting questions to our panelists. And so this was our discussion about fake news, organized by the America House Nordrhein-Westfalen and the CBYX. Thank you so much for listening, and everybody has a very good night. And thank you to Kurt and Angie for this great discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Angie. This was great.
Thank you. Thank you so much.